Hello, hello everyone. Welcome to the Ideal Adjudicator training program. Today we have Hadar with us. Initial introduction of Hadar. She's the WDC Best Speaker last year and going to be the Chief Adjudicator in the 2024. But more importantly, she is quite committed to the developing Indian circuit, making us and you guys reaching the pinnacle, or wherever the pinnacle we can reach together. And this is one part of that process, or the mechanism that creating good adjudicator in the India, because a good adjudicator is essentially a part of developing good debaters from that particular circuit, and that's in that line. And with that, Hadar, we have the judges, and we can start the program.
Cool. Can I check that I'm properly heard?
Yes.
Okay. Do I have the option to share screen? I have two accounts, one of my laptop, one from my phone, because my camera on my laptop isn't working.
You can share it from anyone, whichever you want.
Okay, awesome. Okay.
In the meanwhile, it will be great to see other debaters. I know it's like 8:30 p.m. in the India if you want to put your cameras, but otherwise you're happy. Yeah.
Okay. Can I check first that everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So since we have three different calls throughout this weekend, I figured I'll divide it into the three things that throughout the form you indicated would be most useful for you. So today we are going to focus a lot on the actual process of comparisons and reaching the right call in theory. In the next couple of sessions, we'll delve more deeply into one, the deliberation process and how to be a good wing or a good chair, and two, the process of giving a good OA and so on. So we will distribute it into the kind of three different roles a judge has: reaching the call, and reaching the agreement in the discussion, as well as giving the OA, which will combine partly with tracking because these are related. Firstly, few observations on what makes an argument persuasive, which will be serving us as intro for the rest of this call. Generally, there are three different metrics we consider when we talk about an argument being persuasive within the context of a debate. First is the analysis provided for the likelihood of that argument. The second is the importance of the argument, and the third is relevance. Few important observations, which I think are related to some of the questions that were asked in the form, that I want to explain a bit more in depth here. Firstly, arguments have different thresholds of how much analysis we expect for in terms of their likelihood, importance, and relevance. What do I mean by that? Debate is an objective game as much as we can make it, and we'll discuss it soon in terms of the three cores or three pillars of good adjudication. However, it is not a game that is entirely devoured from reality. And this means that different arguments will require varying degrees of analysis to convince us that they are likely or important or relevant. So, for an instance, take the argument in the motion, this house would lift the sanctions, or this house believes that the West should lift the sanctions from North Korea. Proposition might argue that the sanctions cause a bad will of North Korea to reach negotiation with the West. Say that this is the argument that OG is making. And they prove that North Korea has little willingness to negotiate. Say CG is extending on a similar argument and says, in fact, this antagonizes Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime so much that they are likelier to default into using nuclear arms. Question: which of the claims do you find more compelling? Let's make it a question to the audience. Raise your hand. Yeah, Ojas?
Yeah, the former. Just
Why?
I think for a couple of reasons. The impact is generally lower. It's not as extreme. That is, I would assume that the threat of nuclear weapons or their use has far more wider reaching and qualitatively worse impacts, and therefore would require similarly greater analysis to prove.
Isn't that inserting yourself into the debate? Both teams gave the same degree of asserted intuition based on my example. Why are we more willing to buy the OG assertion than the CG assertion?
I think just because likelihood is something we need to consider, right? I think that there are plenty of other factors that go into preventing or causing the use of nuclear weapons beyond just, say, the presence or lifting of sanctions.
Mm-hmm. In other words, and this is a point that is important for me to explain for a sec, because I think this led to a lot of confusion based on what I saw in the questions and answers. Inserting ourselves to the debate would be placing arbitrary burdens on teams with no grounding. It is different when teams make the poor strategical choice to take extra burdens on themselves. If CG chooses to take the burden to prove full-on nuclear war, then their burden is to prove full-on nuclear war. We are not placing it on them. They took it on themselves. So in other words, when teams choose to take a smaller burden, they often trade off between likelihood and importance. Few general notes, and we'll delve a bit deeper into each of them soon. Firstly, in abstract in a vacuum, neither of these is more important than the other. This is a common question I often get. How do you compare if OG gives an argument that is very likely, but very low impact, and OO gives an argument that is very unlikely, but very high impact? Who should win? What do you think? In this situation, one team gives very likely low impact, the other gives very unlikely high impact. Who should win? Any thoughts? All right, from the chat, it would seem most of you are leaning likelihood over impact. The real answer is there's not enough information to answer this question. The real question is, it depends. Comparing likelihood and impact is a bit like comparing apples and oranges. A team that gave a less likely argument with very high impact could potentially still win. For example, if they gave some analysis that is insufficient to meet the very big impact they promised, but should still be credited for the degree of analysis that they did give, that still has some remaining impact standing. Let's take an example. If we have the motion, this house as the LGBTQ plus community would cancel Pride. Let's imagine OG gives the analysis that pride causes antagonism. They give some analysis and some reasoning to make it likely that it causes antagonism, such as it is usually very provocative in nature. It has to be to attract attention. It's the direct incentive of those who organize it. People tend to extrovert their sexuality a lot more because this is the one event in the year where they have the opportunity to do so. So it creates a sense of reinforcing stereotypes for people who watch from a distance. It can lead to roadblocks and so on. And then they deduce the impact, and therefore people will commit more hate crimes and be violent against LGBTQ plus people. This is probably a far-fetched and not so likely impact that might happen occasionally, but is not the likely impact of their case. Doesn't mean that we need to entirely discredit their case. What do you think? I see a no in the chat. Why shouldn't we? Banchaj, go.
Just to ask for a clarification, even if we say no to it, can we insert this implicit question that sure, maybe large scale violence isn't necessary, but if you characterize people as like, say, against the LGBTQ community, microaggressions are likely to happen, which is far more reasonable of a claim to make. But then again, the question then is, can I go with this reasoning, or I have to wait for the teams to make that explicit claim?
So the answer is, we are crediting teams for everything they proved and only for what they proved. I believe that you would agree with me in this case. They did not prove the likelihood of full-on violence. I believe you will also agree with me that they proved more than nothing. The real claim that they proved is antagonism. And antagonism, so far, stands. This means I am not going to fill in for them any specific, more nuanced impact that I would expect them to argue in the lines of microaggressions. Had I been them, maybe I would try to show the more likely impact of this, such as casual discrimination, unnice language and bullying, perhaps parents who are less accepting of their children when they come out, and so on. But I'm not going to fill in this impacting for them because they did not prove it. What I will do is credit them for proving antagonism. They did not yet prove a compelling mobilization to action that is a likely action to be taken, but they did prove people will like LGBTQ plus people less. Before, of course, OO comes into the table and might give compelling analysis to the contrast. This is important. I intentionally put this grid as a sort of intuition. The real answer is all three of these metrics are spectrums. They are not binaries. There is no such thing as 0% proven unless a speaker literally comes up, ties their shoelace, and comes down. Nor do we have 100% proven in the context of a 7-minute speech in most cases. The question is always, where does the argument place on these three spectrums? And we can think of them as three axes of a graph. You have the likelihood axis, the importance axis, and the relevance axis. Neither of them independently is more important than the other, but rather, when we combine where does the argument place on all three of them, we can start comparing. In other words, you can think of it similar to how we calculate utility. Utility is probability times impact, right? So if I flip a coin and heads I win 100 rupees, tails, I lose 100 rupees. What's the utility? That's like basic intro to maths. The last part of maths I'm going to ask of you for judging. On net utility, what am I likely to win? Okay, I've brought math into the table so people don't want to stick now. I fully accept that. The answer is we would quantify the impact times likelihood. In this case, it would be 0 because I can equally win 100 rupees or lose 100 rupees. If the chances were 50% to win 100 rupees, 50% to lose nothing and win nothing, the utility would be 50 rupees. Similarly, and in an analogy that is hopefully intuitive rather than unintuitive because math, we are quantifying likelihood times importance times relevance. And there are many ways we are going to simplify this work for us soon. But an argument isn't more important de facto just because it's likelier, and we don't have a heuristic to always determine between a high likelihood, low impact argument and a high impact, low likelihood argument. The question would be, when we quantify how likely it is times how important it is, what do we have in the end? The likelihood times the impact. Do we have something more or less persuasive? Now, I do not want you to do maths. This is why there are several methods we will use to simplify this frame of thought and reach these conclusions in debate. Before I delve more deeply into these methods, are there questions on the more abstract philosophical point behind why we don't arbitrarily credit likelihood over importance or vice versa, or any other metric over the other? Okay, I was asked in the chat if likelihood isn't logically prior to impact. Yes and no. This is the cheat trick of weighings and why I think 90% of logical priority weighings end up as a lie. A compelling lie, but still a lie. The brief answer is likelihood and impact are logically prior in about a symmetrical way. Why? If something has very high impact but no likelihood, obviously, we don't care. It's not going to happen in the world. But if something has 100% likelihood and no impact, we also don't care. It does nothing in the world. They have to come together. An argument has to be both true and important. This is why it's a bit not useful for us to think of what's logically prior to what. Both of them are needed. The question is, assuming we have more than 0 on both, because neither is a binary, we have now some likelihood of some impact in the world. What do we find more compelling at the end of it? Other questions so far? Cool. In which case, what does a good judge do? These will be the 3 holy pillars of adjudication. And from that moment on, we'll get a bit into a deeper dive into how we use them to assess likelihood, impact, relevance, and the interaction between them. Firstly, a good adjudication is a comparative adjudication. These, like comparative, holistic, and objective, are the 3 rules that almost everyone knows, but I find not many judges actually know how to use or think enough of how to use them. Because, and I find this to be a general useful tool, I can answer many micro-specific questions, and I will try and leave like 10 minutes or so in the end of this workshop for Q&A. But I think the more useful thing you can do as judges, since many judging dilemmas will come about your ways, is develop a judging philosophy that is coherent, consistent, and fair, that follows these three pillars, so that you are able to generate your own responses with every dilemma that comes your way. Judging being comparative is one of the most useful tools you can use to answer some of the complex gray area questions of judging. Most people think of comparative adjudication as only meaning something like there are no automatic fourths and no automatic firsts. This is of course true. There's not an auto first or an auto fourth. However, it means much more than that. It means everything we need to assess, we are going to assess comparatively. And if we think about it further, this should give us answers to some of the trickier questions. For example, the question of how much should we insert ourselves into the debate? Say there's a very obvious response, but no one gave it, or we know something to be wrong in real life, but debaters don't point it out. All of these classic questions. Do we intervene or do we let debate land do its thing? The best answer would always start with, whichever we choose, we apply it symmetrically across all teams. So if I expect some degree of analysis for OG to make their argument stand, I would expect a similar degree of analysis from OO. Similarly, when people ask me something like, how much analysis is sufficient for an argument to stand in a vacuum, absent challenges? Do we accept it as automatically standing if no one answered it? At what point do we stop intervening and stop calling it an assertion? My answer to this would always be, depends on the debate. If this is a very fresh novice round, and all speakers are very inexperienced, and all of them give very little analysis, I would give a lot of credit to a lot of the little analysis given, mostly because this is the comparative way to judge the debate. I cannot choose to ignore all arguments because none of them are proven. I can't give everyone fourth. I will ask myself, who gave, comparatively speaking, more analysis? Even if all teams proved very little of an argument, if one team proved 10% likelihood and the other team proved 20% likelihood of their impacts on the same clash, I will go with the 20% likelihood, even though probably neither of them would prove the argument to be actually standing. Similarly, an argument does not absolutely stand if I'm judging a very good room and one team proved their argument to a 90% extent and the other proved it to the 95%. I would choose the team that gave comparatively more analysis. I'm going to give a few caveats to what I said right now soon, but first I want to point out, this is also how we judge vertical extensions and same bench comparisons. When we ask ourselves if a vertical extension gave sufficient analysis to matter, the question is always a comparative one. Only did they give better analysis than what their top half did. It doesn't matter for that purpose if top half already proved the argument, because as observed, there's no such thing as proving an argument in an absolute. You don't either prove it or don't prove it. You prove it to an extent. If bottom half proved it to a better extent with more likelihood, more impact, more relevance, they can still win. Now, there are going to be a few caveats to this observation. Do try to keep yourself muted, and if you have a question, either write in the chat or raise hand, just because otherwise we'll get into some mess. There are, of course, some caveats to this. Probably the biggest one is, this is not how we do speaker scores. As I said, the focus of today is how to reach the right call. Of course, despite applying different standards in a novice room and in a top room, when I give the call in order to be comparative in both rooms, I would apply the same standards when I give speaker scores. I will not pretend a poorly proven argument is high speaks and very well done just because it won the room. But when deciding the call, the only question that matters then is how it fares comparatively to the rest of the room. There are also obviously questions involving how well the argument was answered, did teams do weighings from within the debate, and so on, but those we'll delve a bit more into later. The one last thing I want to observe about being comparative is, if you think about it, this should also help you answer the question of how do we compare an argument that is likely but low impact into an argument that is unlikely but high impact. I can't compare apples and oranges very easily, but I can be comparative and say, if the margin of difference between how likely the claim was made is smaller than the margin of difference from how high impact it is, I might go with the higher impact claim. In other words, in the North Korean sanctions example, if OG were to prove 90% likelihood of North Korea being less willing to enter negotiation, and CG proved 50% likelihood of North Korea starting a nuclear war, it is quite likely I would opt for CG over OG here. Because despite OG having the higher impact, the higher likelihood, the margin of difference between just how much more impactful the CG claim is versus how little less likely it was made would make me believe that even a 50% chance at a nuclear war is sufficiently frightening for the average intelligent voter to prefer the certain risk or nearly certain risk of no negotiation over the uncertain but highly plausible risk of a nuclear war. This does not go ad infinitum, of course. If CG only proved an infinitesimal is the English, I think, chance of a nuclear war, like 1 in a million, probably this comparison would then flip, because the margin of difference in likelihood is so much greater than the margin of difference in impact. So I can't always compare arguments on the exact same spectrum unless teams are actually arguing on the same metric, which is fortunate and convenient when it happens, but is not always the case. What I can do when I need to compare between different axes is ask who has the higher edge up in their relative axis, in the one that they are winning. If they are having the advantage on likelihood, how much of an advantage on likelihood they have versus how much of an advantage on impact do they have. Are there questions on how to use the rule of being comparative in debating to help us determine close comparisons? Ojas?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't, we've been discussing the same bench comparisons so far, but a question I have is with regard to comparing like Gov bench against, say, closing opposition, where where opening and closing Gov are making different arguments. Let me say North Korea example, right? If a team on opposition is able to rebut like the more likely of those scenarios to a great extent, but does not do so, like doesn't rebut the less likely scenario because they see it as irrelevant or whatever. In that scenario, they don't adequately address the less likely impact. How exactly does that weigh out if we're still putting opening gov or closing gov for whatever reason?
Is the question, how do we place CO relative to the gov bench in this case?
Yes. So essentially, where the metrics on the gov benches are different, and an opposition team only responds to one of those metrics adequately. Like how does the comparison weigh out there?
That depends. The answer would be also reliant somewhat on CO's constructive material and how to weigh it off in the debate. Personally, I do think judging is transitive, although I realize this is recently an unpopular take. However, in most cases, if OG is decisively over CG and CO is decisively over OG because of having the rebuttal, even absent the extension from CO, which usually be what I would use to determine then why they are winning CG despite not directly rebutting CG, I would remind rebuttal is also extension. And what I can credit them with is the negative material. Now, if CO very effectively proved 100% of the OG material falls, it is equivalent to them negating the same degree of proven impact. So if from the get-go, we felt the OG material was stronger than the CG material because the likelihood was so much higher, say, then by the same reason, the contribution of taking it down is more valuable and has better analytical contribution on likelihood times impact because it takes down a very likely impact than the CG very unlikely addition. In most debates, it will be a bit easier to judge because CO will also have a constructive, as well as in most debates, CO will not take down OG 100%, and some of OG will remain standing. So they will be forced to also engage CG somewhat to not only rely on the transitive comparison. But this question brings me precisely to what is the second metric or pillar of good judging. Good judging is holistic. It includes everything that was said in the debate, or most everything. We are still meant to ignore contradictions and new material in whips, but otherwise everything. And it treats all forms of content equally. There is no distinction between whether you frame material as an argument, a refutation, a POI, a weighing, or any other framing for what your content is. Content is content, and all content should be thought of on these three axes: likelihood, importance, and relevance. So to answer your question, if CO did not engage CG, but gave very, very good rebuttal to OG, it means that they have very strong, likely, important, and relevant negative material. You can think of it as the negative side of these axes. And similar to how we would weigh the OG over CG for their contribution in the total being over the CG contribution, then the equivalent negation of these contributions should also be larger. Does that answer the question?
Yep, thank you.
Cool. The third pillar of good adjudication is being objective, with an asterisk. Objective means, firstly, we don't insert our views to the debate. That much is more obvious. We might have an opinion on are we more with prop or op in real life. It also has the more nuanced implication of we are not assigning different burdens to arguments because we personally find them more intuitive. This is similar, but slightly different to the first observation. The first observation is what I find people find easy to know. The second one is where more judges tend to run into mistakes, because many arguments sound more intuitive to us, not because of an opinion bias. It's not a left-wing or right-wing thing. It's not a question of our beliefs and worldviews. It is often a question of what is familiar in our associative world, whether it's because we heard this argument a lot of times, or because we find it easier to explain because we have knowledge about it, and so on. To give a couple of examples, a lot of buzzwords that people started using in debating are frequently used without giving any analysis for them whatsoever, such as people have optimism bias. This is why we can't trust them with their own pensions. The word optimism bias is not analysis. The words optimism bias are a headline. The reason why so many judges are susceptible to credit the words optimism bias without analysis is because we are used to have heard these arguments so many times that subconsciously we fill in analysis for things. Similar things happen with many commonly repeating arguments. Things such as hedonic treadmill or lack of epistemic access, and many more other arguments we heard frequently. I remember there was a time in Tel Aviv, you could say the words intensity of preferences and not need to explain a single thing, and judges would buy it because Dan and Ayal made intensity of preferences arguments so much, everyone already knew what they mean. But this is equally bad to inserting our political views to the debate. Debaters should be credited for what they prove. The caveat is, of course, as we said earlier, we don't expect the same degree of analysis from all different claims. Teams should be rewarded for choosing more intuitive claims and should be expected to analyze better the less intuitive claims. However, the question of what makes an intuitive or an unintuitive claim is not to be determined by what's intuitive to me. It's to be determined by what's intuitive to the globally informed voter. More on that in a sec. But if you were to ask a random person on a street, what is hedonic treadmill, they would have no clue. If you were to ask an average person on the street, what do you mean by intensity of preferences, they would also not know this. Some of you might know these things as debaters who heard it again and again and again. This, if you start applying into debate, would both detach debating even farther from the real world persuasion, as well as give unfair advantage to teams that just happen to come for very arbitrary reasons to a more common world of associations as you, such as speakers from your circuit. This would be an implicit bias. This is why when we ask ourselves if something is intuitive enough to stand without further analysis, we ask not what we find compelling and intuitive, but what would an average, intelligent, and educated person would think. Very briefly on the globally informed voter, because this is one that seems to confuse a lot of people, and I think also I recall many of you answered wrongly on that question, so I will use that example. In one of the questions in the form, I asked, how do we decide what is the important metric in the debate if teams didn't themselves weigh and analyze this metric? One of the answers that many of you responded, and is one of the false answers to this question, is deciding based on which team impacts the most vulnerable stakeholder. Question. Anyone has any idea why inserting the most vulnerable stakeholder metric is not a good way for a judge to insert themselves into the debate? Why it's not an objective metric? Any thoughts? Everything in debate is subjective. The chat suggested subjective vulnerability is subjective, sure, but it could be analyzed, just like anything in debate. There's a more fundamental reason. I'll make it easier for you for a sec. Say, okay, different answers in the chat. Let me ask you a slightly more extreme example of what I'm intending, and maybe that will help direct you. Say there is a debate, such as the Korea World's, I believe it was quarters, might be octos, I might be confusing them. But whichever was, this house supports the Biden administration's decision to invest multiple billions of dollars into the infrastructure projects for stimulus during COVID. What do you think about the metric of where is the Democratic Party likelier to win? Would that help the electability of Biden or harm it? Is this an objective metric? Any thoughts? Was the question unclear? Yeah, Banjaj?
If the team starts with giving us the incentive structure of Biden as to like maintaining his position as the president over something else, as in like a medical emergency, probably then this metric of where the Democratic Party is likely to win is of higher value. Because if at any point of time some opposition team could come up and say that, well, right now it's not about whether you're winning or not, but it's just about how many lives are you saving. That's kind of the primary, because that's the context. Probably
I have a
then
more important question. Is the globally informed voter a Democrat, a DNC voter?
No, won't be so. Not at all.
Is it a consensus that the DNC is preferable to the Republican Party?
There is no such preference about any political party.
This is a preference that debaters often assume in motions that are not from the perspective of the DNC. It's not this house as the DNC supports. It's this house supports. Universal perspective. We have no reason to assume, if no one analyzes, that the DNC is better than the Republican Party. Absolutely no reason. Similarly, most vulnerable stakeholder is a metric that needs to be proven as what we should care about or prioritize. The general trade-off applying usually with regards to minorities is, on the one hand, they're more vulnerable, on the other hand, there are less of them. What should we care about more? This is a subjective value assessment that different people would have different answers to outside of debate, depending on if they care more about progressive justice and correcting old wrongs, or if they care more about utilitarian justice and helping the majority. None of them is, by default, better or worse than the other. This is why inserting the metric of the minorities are more important because they are the most vulnerable stakeholder is equally interventionist to a judge who would say they don't buy minority arguments or they underweigh minority arguments because they impact less people. Completely symmetric interventionism, only in the opposite directions. This is one of the classic examples of where people don't notice that they insert themselves into the debate. So remember, the globally informed voter knows the general gist of most things, shares the very commonly held moral views, such as, I don't know, killing people is bad, but they are otherwise a tabula rasa. They have no views, principles, or morals of their own to guide them. And therefore, we should not decide on their behalf unless teams analyzed that we care more arbitrarily about a metric such as vulnerability. Is this point clear? Any questions? Yeah, Raja Vardhan. Apologies in advance for all names I'm butchering, by the way. This will be
yeah, no worries about that. I just had like a question, like in these situations where one team is arguing on the metric, like prioritizing the metric of like utilitarian, like benefit to the majority, and the other team is more focused on like, benefiting the most vulnerable people. How do you exactly weigh it out? I know like the general answer would be like the one who analyzes it better, but like still like any example you could think of in this sense.
So I will answer this the way I would want you guys to answer yourselves these questions. There's a reason why I said these three pillars are important to build a judging philosophy. And I think it's important that rather than have a judging checklist and a manual to micromanage how you judge, you will be able to develop your own way of thinking to answer judging dilemmas when they come about. In this case, if I would run into this dilemma of competing weighings, I would use the pillar of holistic adjudication. What does holistic adjudication tell me? That all content is equal. A weighing is just like an argument. In other words, if one team prioritizes the metric of vulnerability and the other prioritizes the metric of quantity, I treat it the same way I would treat a OG that would give an argument and an OO that would give a completely different competing argument without rebutting OG. And these teams don't rebut each other. I now have different arguments without engagement between them to decide on. And I would decide on this precisely the same way I would decide on the argumentation. How well they were analyzed, how relevant are they to the debate, how well are they impacted. In the case of a weighing, if one team analyzed the weighing better, easy. If not, second question, relevance. Is one of the weighings more unique to the debate or more relevant or more clearly impacted by the motion than the other? If not, let's go with the impacting. Sometimes teams don't compare between the different weighings they have, but one of them will impact it better. So the team that discusses vulnerability can actually explain and visualize through characterization what are the implications on vulnerable people and so on, that could still be, well, not ideal, and ideally I would want a more comparative assessment, better than just asserting more people is more important. If absolutely nothing happens, not even an intuition pump, not even throwing an analogy of, in this case, we prefer the majority, or in this case, we prefer the minorities, and this is why we should apply it here as well, then I would insert the globally informed voter. In this particular case, what would they prefer? And the answer is usually never one or the other in absolute. The globally informed voter doesn't have an absolute preference for vulnerability or quantities, just like they don't have an absolute preference for utility or principles. The globally informed voter would prefer to divert a trolley to run over one person than 5 people, but would not harvest one person to donate their organs to 5 people. The globally informed voter usually have case-by-case based intuitions. In the case of the specific debate, I would ask, which is more intuitive to be the group that we care about? One useful question then, in terms of vulnerable actors, is asking how relevant is their vulnerability to the specific motion at hand. So, for example, let's take the vulnerable minority that is disabled people. If the motion is about a topic that significantly impacts disabled people, such as creating separate classes for the disabled versus having them integrated in people who are not disabled, in able-bodied schools. Obviously, in this debate, even if disabled people are the minority, I would probably care about them more because the degree to which the motion is relevant to them is very high. Whereas, if the debate is about something that sounds like it impacts all groups, vulnerable and not vulnerable alike, very similarly, such as a motion on should we reveal to humanity that the world is going to end in a year, I don't know why the vulnerability of someone who is disabled is more important. And I have no reason to arbitrarily prioritize this group in this particular motion. So oftentimes, also bringing back the question of relevance, and in the context of this motion, is it intuitive that the vulnerability matters or not, can also help with this weighing. But of course, ideally, we would want teams to answer this question for us. Any more questions on these 3 pillars of adjudication philosophy? Yeah, Banshaj?
Yes, just a common dilemma. In the pursuit of saying that I don't want to intervene, like this happened in one of the finals. The motion was that this house believes that communism suffers from lack of integrity in terms of implication, like in terms of application, rather than philosophical problems, as in inherently there is something wrong with communism. I, as an individual, like as a personal preference, I know that communism isn't like via principle, also it's not working because it assumes that classes, the only metric of classes is based on money or wealth, etc., which is not true because we have multiple ways by which people divide themselves. Even if you remove money as a metric, probably something else would come.
Mm-hmm.
But that was my assertion for it. And I don't want to engage myself. I don't want to intervene. So I questioned myself implicitly, and I was kind of expecting opposition to raise these questions, which they didn't, on challenging by saying that, hey, there are other metrics of division as well. So in pursuit of me not being biased to one side, I think that I'm being more aggressive in terms of like expecting a lot more from the opposing side in general. Though to explain it, I went in and said that, well, these things lead to implicit questions that you need to answer in order to go. But can implicit questions can be a way to get out of this, at least in oral adjudication? Because again, I have my set ideas, and if I don't want to intervene, I can be a harsher on the other side if they don't point it out.
The answer to this, and again, the best way to get an answer to all questions is developing a philosophy and being consistent with it. I'll apply it comparatively. If OG analyzed in the debate why money or class is the origin of all division and oppression, even if I don't believe in it, and OP didn't rebut it, of course I would go with OG. If OG asserted it and OP rebutted it, of course I would go with OO. The difficult question would become, what if OG gave non-compelling analysis that OO didn't answer? And the question would be, as always, I credit them to the extent that they prove their case. I will not fill in responses that they did not get, but I will not fill in analysis for them that they did not give. So it is possible, for example, having not seen the debate to discuss, but I imagine many OGs would run something around the lines of proving that class and money is a source of oppression, but not proving that it is the source of oppression or the only one. In which case, this is exactly what I would credit them with. And by the end, it would be sufficient or insufficient to win, depending on what is the OO contribution. A follow-up question that you might find useful, related to what you said about the implicit questions, is how many steps must I fill in for the teams? So if both teams gave somewhat intuition-based analysis, but not fully substantiated it, with OG starting the analysis for class being at the heart of all oppression, and OO starting the analysis for other forms of oppression existing, but neither of them quite proving it to the full extent, I would ask myself, which team would require me to be more charitable for them, for the case to stand? If I am to step in, I will step in equally, not asymmetrically. If I have to do more legwork for one of the teams for their case to stand than I do for the other team, then comparatively speaking, the team I have to do less legwork for has the better analysis. Ideally, I would have to do no work for neither because they would do their jobs. Realistically, if I have to step in, all I need to do is do it comparatively and symmetrically. Does this answer the question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. I think we are technically out of the 1 hour that we set for this. So what I think we should do now in preparation for tomorrow, I will not force anyone to stay on this call because you might have plans. I will send, for those who want some extra work to watch on, a link to a recorded workshop I gave on clashes, how to find clashes and how to use clashes. Admittedly, it was more targeted towards speakers, but I find it can still, or is very useful for judging, because in the next workshop, we'll do a very brief intro to clashes that would not cover them very in depth, and you can perhaps learn more in your free time. Other than that, I will stay with those who want to stay on call for 2 main purposes now. The first is to answer concrete questions you have. And the second is to ask, where would you want me to direct the focus of tomorrow's workshop? This is very dynamic, I think, and I really don't want to add more repetitive material on the already existing, which is why I asked you all to watch the Judging Academy from Korea in advance. Hence, I want to tailor the next 2 workshops we have to what you'll find most useful. I will stop share screening now. Do you have questions? Ojas?
Yeah, I think again, on diagonal comparisons, something, an issue I've come across while judging BPs, admittedly this might just be because of how the circuit looks, but in general, what I've seen multiple times is that a clash is sort of unresolved at opening. That is, opening government makes an assertion or a claim or analyzes an argument, and opening opposition doesn't adequately address it in terms of like response or like taking it down. But opening opposition like has a bunch of material that goes unaddressed from opening government. When there's a whole bunch of stuff left like open in the debate, where there's essentially no conclusion to opening, then
there has to be a conclusion to opening. Yes,
but like, there isn't really. What I mean to say is that there isn't like a endpoint like the argumentation. Like it isn't necessarily convincing enough as it is. Obviously, like there is some weighing between the 2 teams, obviously, but at the point where it's just like a bunch of open ends left in the case. And closing half becomes one team pushing an extension in terms of like new or what horizontal extension, and another and the other team either focusing on whipping up the top half and like essentially extending vertically, right? Where this happens, what exactly is the metric for weighing if there isn't enough comparison within the vertical extension from one closing bench and the horizontal extension from another closing bench?
I might need a clearer example in my mind.
Right. So
Are you talking? Go on.
yeah. So where the closing half is essentially doing two radically different things, where one of the say closing opposition is essentially extending vertically and whipping up an unclear debate that happened at top half, and closing gov says extending horizontally, that is they're introducing new material that's not discussed at opening.
Yeah.
In such a case, is there a specific type of argumentation that should be credited over the other if there isn't enough engagement? Because this is something I've seen happen where the horizontal extension and the vertical extension are entirely parallel to each other. Is there anything that is inherently more value, or is it just like, again,
whichever is better on likelihood, impact, and relevance? I think that the sad and good answer to most of the questions people tend to have on adjudication is there are no good rules of thumb to most of these questions. If there were, you would not need good judges. We would already be replaced by AI. Might happen someday. But the matter is, the manual is here to create standardization across many things, but it cannot micromanage how we judge every specific case. What I aim to do in these workshops is not give a clear guideline to which argument is superior to which argument always in abstract. Sometimes horizontal extensions are better, sometimes verticals are better, it all depends. But what I want you to get is the right thinking patterns and questions to ask to be able to assess this. So for example, in the case you describe, one of the first questions I would ask is, which is the more important clash or metric in the debate? Ideally based on what teams analyze it to be, less ideally based on what the globally informed voter would think if teams didn't analyze what it is. If top half identified correctly the right clash, it is very possible that a good vertical on the right clash would be more compelling than a horizontal that opens a different, less important clash. Whereas if top half missed the right clash and bottom half sounds to have a more compelling metric with their new horizontal, I would probably defer to them. Of course, this only seems to prioritize so far the metric, the impact. I would also still look at analysis. Did closing prove their horizontal better, worse, or equally good to top half? And so on. I don't have a rule of thumb answer to this. I know that I would assess all of the arguments under relevance, likelihood, and impact, and I would do so comparatively, holistically, and objectively. I'm not sure if this quite answers the question.
yeah, I mean, fair enough. It's as close as I can get to an answer without a specific round in mind. Makes sense. Yeah.
So I do have a dilemma on where to center tomorrow's workshop. I think we should definitely get more into detail of clashes and how to use them. I am wondering if the focus should be more on comparison between clashes, such as the comparison we do between competing metrics, or inside clashes, how to compare which is the better material on the same metric. Where do you think you find more confusion usually? Okay, I got one vote for the former and one for the latter. I can try and mix around both. It will be a bit tricky given time limits. I will ask, how would you place either of those relative to having a chance to talk more about tracking? Because if we give up most of the talk on how to track a debate, we can afford to focus more on the comparisons part. It's a question of, do you prefer talking about more different skills or go more deeply into comparisons? Yeah, sure, I can include examples in tomorrow's workshop. Noted. Okay. Fair enough. So it seems like popular demand is still to focus more on comparisons, even at the expense of tracking. And in which case, I think we might do a deeper delve into clashes inside and between them. And I think perhaps we'll do it more practice oriented, because my impression was most of your questions today were about how to apply the theory more than what the theory is. So like case by case examples. Would you find it more useful if tomorrow we mostly focus on, say, 4 examples of contents in debate and how to compare them rather than do more new theory? Oh, can do. Awesome. Do you have any more questions, or should I see you tomorrow? Okay, there's one more question in the chat. Impacting is specifically on the part of importance. When we impact an argument, we explain why it's important, why we should care. Likelihood is the part where we explain how true the argument is, and relevance is just the question of how relevant it is to the motion versus how symmetric it is and non-influenced by the motion. Okay. Yeah, Raj?
Oh yeah, hi. Sorry, this is like a very emotional, like, a question on like a very specific motion that happened in UDC. Basically, the motion was about how the House supporting romanticization of like Asian students in Western universities. So my question basically was, say, like, both of the teams have like different stakeholders. Like one is prioritizing Asians which are already studying in the West, or like the diaspora that lives here, while the other team is more prioritizing the Asians that are in Asia, like the ones who haven't migrated yet. So like, and neither of the teams like have given any like analysis as to, you know, why these people are more like this stakeholder is more important than the other. Like I know like there can't be like a rule of thumb to this, but like say if you were in this situation, like what were the questions like you would ask like to yourself like while weighing out the two?
Between the West and Asia?
Yeah, basically like the stakeholders were that the Asian students who are already studying in the West and the diaspora there versus the Asians that are live in Asia.
Several questions I would ask myself. One, relevance. Who's impacted more by the motion? If I remember correctly, the one you're talking about, it would be the motion on media glorifying the Asians going to universities in the West, right?
Yeah, UADC round 1.
Yeah. So the answer would be, depending firstly on relevance, who do I think is likelier to be impacted by this narrative? Does it influence more Asians in the West, or does it influence more those who aspire to move to the West, brain drain, and so on? And the answer to this would be depending on analysis, which of the teams analyzed more compellingly that their stakeholder would be impacted by the narrative, exposed to these movies, and so on. The second question I would ask myself would be the quantity of the relevant stakeholders. And specifically here, there are few moving parts to think of depending on how teams impacted their case. So you have the group of Asians in the West. You have the group of Asians in Asia moving to the West. And you have the group of Asians staying in Asia who will be influenced by the externality of the brain drain. Between the first two teams, I am not sure which is larger. I am sure that the third is the largest. I'm also sure that the third is the least directly impacted by the motion. So now I have the moving axis part. The degree to which the impact on each group was proven times how big the group is would probably be a big part of how I would answer this comparison. If the team to discuss the externalities of brain drain did a very good job in proving that it has a very significant impact, even though it's just a few people who move out, then probably they would win on having the larger scope of their stakeholder impacted. On the other hand, if they didn't, then it seems like their argument would remain limited to the small group of Asians who choose to move to the West. And then it becomes less likely they would win, especially given it sounds harder to impact why it's bad for them than it is to impact why it's bad for the rest of their community. But again, it would depend a lot on the debate. The guiding questions I would ask would be A, how well did each team prove the narrative impacts directly their stakeholder, the stakeholder being exposed, the stakeholder caring about this narrative, and so on. And secondly, how well they proved that this stakeholder is large, significant, and so on. Okay. I think if there are